Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the National Press Club, the place where news happens. I'm Mike Balsamo. I'm the 118th president of the National Press Club and the National Law Enforcement Editor at the Associated Press. Joyce Vance is a former U.S. Attorney for the Northern District of Alabama, appointed by President Barack Obama. As U.S. Attorney, she led major prosecutions in areas ranging from public corruption and civil rights to national security and corporate fraud. She established her office's first civil rights enforcement unit, and she's a law professor at the University of Alabama School of Law. Many of you here tonight know her for her wildly read Substack newsletter, Civil Discourse, that helps Americans decipher the law and the justice system, make connection to what is happening in our country, and to understand what's at stake. Her new book, Giving Up Is Unforgivable, a manual for keeping a democracy, could not be timelier. It's a reflection on how democratic institutions erode, often slowly, through disengagement, through disinformation, and how distrust and how ordinary citizens can help shore them up through everyday civil action. It's not a partisan book. It's a practical one about participation, accountability, and the habits that sustain democracy. That message resonates deeply here at the National Press Club. We're an organization built on the idea that a free press and an informed public are inseparable from a functioning democracy. And around the world, and even here at home, journalists face new pressures: disinformation campaigns, hostility toward the press, and growing attempts to undermine public confidence in factual reporting. Joyce Vance's work speaks directly to that moment. She reminds us that transparency, truth-telling, and civil literacy aren't luxuries. They're the foundation of a self-government. Her call to not give up is, in many ways, a call for all of us, as journalists, lawyers, educators, and citizens alike, to keep doing the work that democracy requires, even when the climate feels uncertain. And so tonight, she'll discuss the ideas behind Giving Up Is Unforgivable, explore the relationship between the law, public trust, and civic responsibility, and consider how each of us, whether in the newsroom or in a voting booth, plays a role in protecting democratic institutions. Please join me in welcoming Joyce Vance to the National Press Club. So Joyce, thank you again for being here. Why don't we jump right in here?
Let's do it.
All right. So one of the greatest questions journalists grapple with today is what happens when the press is under pressure, right? Whether from disinformation or from political attacks or public distrust. How do you see the role of a free press in an ecosystem of democracy as you describe in your book?
You know, Thomas Jefferson once said that if he had to choose between some of the other institutions of government and the free press, that he would choose a free press. And I think it's so easy for all of us to understand why that's the case. I have often thought about, the dirty little secret of being a prosecutor, which is that it's typically not the FBI that commences a public corruption investigation. It's usually the press, right? And what do we all do first thing in the morning? We read, whether we consume traditional news or news-style media. Many of us will start our days doing that. We won't feel complete until we're informed. And so I think it's easy to understand why the press matters. It's less easy, frankly, and I'm so sympathetic to the position that you all are in, to live in a world where the press is under attack. And the picture that I thought was so painful was the video of members of the Pentagon News Corps walking out of the Pentagon. It was a shameful moment in American history, and so maybe the best way I can answer your question is to say that this is a moment where American citizens should defend the press, should support the press. That might mean different things for different people. I know that when my husband sees how many different newspapers I pay monthly subscriptions to, he gets a little bit torqued. Honey, I'm sorry if you're watching. But I do think it's important for us to support so that they can do their jobs. I have nothing but respect for the press.
Thank you for that. And I would just say, the moment that we're seeing right now, particularly around the Pentagon Press Association and what's happening there, is an incredible moment in history. And I'm incredibly proud that the National Press Club has played an important part in that fight.
You know, we say incredible moment because, what's the word that you're supposed to use, right? You can only say horrific and traumatic and unprecedented. So many times I feel like we need to invent a new vocabulary for moments like that.
I think that's fair. Unprecedented is wide,
I just
too
don't
widely
say it
used,
anymore
right?
because everything is.
So, Joyce, in your book, you combine civic history, legal context, and some practical guidance. Can you talk a little bit about, maybe identify a historical precedent you draw on that you believe is especially relevant to what we're witnessing right now?
You know, there are so many moments in our history where the people living in that moment thought something had happened that was so terrible that democracy couldn't survive it. And in that sense, the lessons of history are very powerful because even though this is the unprecedented moment in American history, for everybody else, I suspect it felt like that. And I think the important lessons that we learn from our history, there are a couple of them. One is don't take a snapshot of the moment that you live in. Look at the video instead, because for instance, there's this terrible moment in American history, the Dred Scott Supreme Court case that many of you will be familiar with, where the Supreme Court said, not only can Congress not outlaw slavery, black people aren't people. They don't have a right to vote. They can never be citizens. And that was the law of the land for decades. And it took a bloody civil war. It took Congress to finally be the institution that grew up and stood up and passed amendments to the Constitution that changed all of that for us to get a fix. And so I think I'm an optimistic person by nature, and I'm optimistic about the future of this country, but not unreasonably so. And I don't think we can fix this with one election or with, one cycle, one lunar cycle or whatever it is we call it these days. I do think we're on a longer trajectory to fixing this country's problems. It's an endeavor that we'll pass on to our children and to our grandchildren. But I look at moments like Dred Scott, and then I think about Congress proudly standing up and passing the amendments that made it possible for us to move forward. And I'm also cognizant, quite frankly, that we have never had a national reckoning on issues of race. That's something that simply has not happened, that is yet to come. And it's because democracy is largely aspirational. It's not perfect. I don't know that it will ever be perfect. That doesn't mean that it's not worthy and that our goals aren't worthy. It means that we're always a work in progress. And that's something that in this moment is very difficult to accept, because I would like for us to finish the work, but that's not how it's going to happen.
What does that look like? What does the sort of like decades and decades look like? And, and to your point about Congress, where do you see Congress's involvement in this moment right now?
So my friend Dahlia Lithwick, who many of you I'm sure are familiar with, a Supreme Court analyst, likes to characterize Congress as being supine. And I think that that's actually the perfect word for what they are. As a body, despite the fact that there are some Democrats who are doing heroes work and even some folks on the other side of the aisle who occasionally wake up and show that they have a pulse, I think by and large, this is a moment where we would all have to agree that Congress is simply a disappointment to all of us. Congress, and this I think is the incredible thing, Congress, which has the power of the purse, is not protecting the power of the purse, right? They're happy to see the White House trample on their constitutional prerogatives. This is maybe the mystery of the moment, because usually institutions that will do nothing else will protect their own power so that they don't become irrelevant, which is what Congress has rendered itself, I think, in these last few months. But always optimistic, right? There's an election in 2026. Every member of the House is up for re-election. A third of the Senate is up for election. Americans are motivated. I think we're better informed than we've ever been as a country. There's no better way to begin to reestablish guardrails in this country, like scrutinizing the people that are running to be your elected representatives, demanding from them that they do the job, right? I think that we've simply fallen into acceptance of elected officials who don't do their jobs. I have 2 Republican senators. People in Alabama had gotten into the habit of saying, well, they're never going to listen to my voice. They don't work for me. Until a group of women in Birmingham, Alabama decided that they would start asking their senators to do better. And they started showing up at their offices and being told that they couldn't go in, and they refused to take that for an answer. And so they would get to know the staff members, for instance, of Senator Tuberville, and work with those people in an effort to try and create conversation. They started putting up these very provocative bulletin boards on the sides of the highway. Some of you may have seen these bulletin boards about Jeffrey Epstein and Donald Trump that dot my drive into work in the mornings. I mean, this is what we have to do. We have to reinvent the ways that we demand that our representatives in Congress do their jobs. That's certainly a work in progress. I think we can all get started.
And today we saw the East Wing of the White House is completely illuminated, right? Photos that came out today show that there's nothing left, including the East Colonnade. That happens despite the fact that major renovations at the White House have largely required multiple approvals, have gone through committees and the like. What do you make of that in this moment as well?
I think it's a deliberate provocation, right? Donald Trump is destroying democracy, and he is telling us that he is destroying democracy. You know that this administration loves the outrage factor because it helps them distract us from important issues. I have to say, early on, I didn't really think that there would be much in the Epstein files. I mean, I'm a former prosecutor. I'm very familiar with what goes into a case file when a case is concluded, what it might look like, and I didn't really think that there would be anything in there that was new and novel. I am less certain of that now. I don't think that they would be working so hard to distract us from that unless there was something pretty spectacular in the mix. But so, I mean, everything that they do in some ways serves that purpose. There's a lot that they need to distract our attention from. But I do think that this is just a very deliberate statement of who Donald Trump is, what he believes he can do, and how he can operate. And it's just, it's so difficult. It's just so difficult to see.
And Joyce, we were talking a little bit earlier about the state of the Justice Department right now. You obviously were a U.S. attorney. You were one of the highest profile U.S. attorneys at the time. Can you talk to us a little bit about what you think of the current state of the Department of Justice, of the Attorney General, and then obviously, we've seen prosecutions of the president's perceived enemies, former FBI Director James Comey. Tomorrow, New York State Attorney General Letitia James will appear in a federal court in Virginia. There's an investigation ongoing into Senator Adam Schiff. What do you see in the current landscape of the Justice Department, and what has sort of stuck out most about what you're seeing right now?
So it's certainly not the Justice Department that I served in. We used to say in my office, so I was a career prosecutor. I had no intention of becoming a political appointee because I really liked my job. Being a line prosecutor is one of the best jobs you'll ever get, and I got to do a lot of civil rights cases, and it was distinctly rewarding. And every time we got a new U.S. attorney, we would just sort of roll our eyes and we would say, we're bees. We be here when they come. We be here when they go. And that was pretty much our view. We didn't love Washington, and I guess I'll embarrass myself and just say, when I was the U.S. attorney, the senior leadership in my office came to me and said, look, we're tired of having those muckalucks from Main Justice come down here, go into our courts in front of our judges, and screw things up. And sometimes the folks from D.C. come down and they can be a little bit heavy-handed, and they don't have to litigate in front of those judges in that district forever. So maybe they're a little bit more aggressive than people in the South tend to be, which is not to say, by the way, that my office was not aggressive. We were, but we were aggressive in a very Southern way. And so we would frequently try to discourage our brethren and sistren in Washington, D.C. from coming down to do cases with us. But like every other U.S. Attorney's Office, I share this in common with my former colleague Preet Bharara in the Southern District of New York and with my colleagues everywhere. Our goal was to do the right thing in the right way for the right reasons. And your politics didn't matter, who your friends were didn't matter. It was quite literally without fear or favor. And it feels so quaint to say that now. But I think it's important to say that we did cases. One of the first cases in my office when I became the U.S. Attorney was the prosecution of 3 Democratic leaders in the state of Alabama. It was a righteous prosecution. And with great regret, I recused from that case because I had been appointed by a Democratic president. And I just thought, nothing good happens here if I do this case. You know, if we prosecute him, it's like, oh, she's trying to be a hard ass to show who she is. And then if they got deals, if anyone got a cooperation deal, there would be the suggestion that they had lenient treatment. And so it was very important to me to walk away from that case and to let the career folks in my office handle it. And that is perhaps in sharp contrast to what we've seen in the Eastern District of Virginia. You know, what's happening to Jim Comey is a travesty. And you don't really need to know much other than the fact that senior career, highly regarded people stepped down from their jobs rather than bring an indictment that they understood didn't need to be brought because the evidence wasn't there and maybe a crime hadn't even been convicted. But Jim has a great lawyer. He's represented by Pat Fitzgerald, the former U.S. attorney in Chicago. Pat was a U.S. attorney in the George W. Bush administration, so highly thought of that he stayed on for virtually all of the Obama administration. And he will give his old friend Jim Comey an outstanding defense. But I worry about what that means for people whose name isn't Jim Comey, people who don't have access to a Pat Fitzgerald. Because if this is now an administration where the president, you know, maybe he doesn't like a contractor who worked for him, right? Or maybe he doesn't like some person in the Social Security office nearby who nobody knows that person's name. They have no power, no profile, and suddenly this president can direct his prosecutors to direct the forces of the criminal justice system against them. This is a moment where we are all at risk. It's not a spectator sport watching Tish James get prosecuted or finding out if Adam Schiff will be next. It's a moment where in very real ways, we are all threatened by this administration, and we need to wake up to that truth.
So along those lines, though, many people feel this democratic fatigue, right? Reading after one crisis after another. How do you suggest journalists in the room engage audiences in a way that doesn't deepen that despair that people feel when they, as you say, scroll through their phone in the morning, but rather sort of mobilizes an informed civic participation?
You know, I think this is really a great question because we know that this effort to overwhelm us, to bombard us, that's a strategic move. I mean, this is, you know, sort of the Steve Bannon, flood the zone sort of approach to things. And Ruth Ben-Ghiat, who is a professor at NYU who writes about strongmen and dictators, has spent a lot of time explaining that this is a deliberate strategy, that they overwhelm us so we will give up and so that we will disengage. I think the media could do a great job of explaining that and of legitimizing those feelings that we all have. There are days where I can no longer keep up with all of the rulings that happen in courts in a given day based on litigation against this administration. I think instead of letting ourselves be overwhelmed by that, we should go ahead and understand what it is, that it's a deliberate attack on us. And how do you handle it? I think, you know, the media, again, plays a role because if you're able to read journalists who can write top-notch summaries, maybe you're the person that wants that broad base of information and you can get that from good journalism. But maybe you want to go deep on an issue that matters to you. Maybe you care about public health and you want to know what Robert Kennedy Jr. is doing to make it less likely that you will be able to get vaccinated this year. And again, I think journalism provides much of the answer for that. What I worry about, frankly, is I just see people who just give up. They're just burned out. They just say, I need to unplug to protect my mental health. And I understand that, truly I do, but I don't think that you're going to be super happy with what happens 6 months down the road if you unplug and Donald Trump can have his way, in essence, with this country.
Disinformation, the undermining of trust in factual reporting are obviously major threats to democracy. But can you talk to us a little bit about what are structural, either legal or institutional tools that you believe still remain, you know, underused for protecting truth and for protecting public accountability?
Well, we all know that you can go and lie to the American people with impunity. It's not a crime. It won't even cost you re-election. And that in and of itself, right, is a great place to start. Maybe we should have a moment where we start demanding truth from our elected leaders. You know, that person. I mean, y'all, I don't know how closely you've been following this litigation out in the Ninth Circuit over deploying the National Guard in Portland, but there's a wonderful judge, Judge Graber, who dissented in the decision that said, in essence, Trump can go ahead and deploy the Guard. And she went like 5 steps back from where everybody else was, and she starts her dissent by saying, it's not true. Portland is not on fire. Federal buildings are not, you know, I'm not quoting her, I'm paraphrasing. Federal buildings aren't on fire. There's not crime in the streets. There's some people in blow-up costumes, but that's about it. And I think it's a remarkable moment where she does not say Donald Trump is a liar, but it's very clear what she's saying. And of course, it matters in the context of that case, because the entire issue that underlies deploying the National Guard is there has to be an invasion, there isn't. There has to be a rebellion, there isn't. Or the president has to be unable to enforce U.S. law with existing resources. And you know, that's what Donald Trump is claiming. And the judge just comes out in a very forthright pattern and says, here's the evidence. And none of the evidence is on his side. And that, to me, is proof that facts matter. What are we going to do about it? You know, I write in the book a little bit about this approach that they take in Finland with school kids, where starting very early on, they teach, not as a class on its own, but in every subject that they teach kids to be critical thinkers and to ask, you know, who wrote this article I'm reading? What are their conclusions? What's their basis for those conclusions? What bias might they have? It seems so very obvious and so easy, but you, like me, may have friends who get on Facebook and don't employ those obvious and easy solutions. I think since we don't have that form of education in this country, maybe it's something we all need to take personal responsibility for, because disinformation is out of hand. It's going to eat us alive if we don't find a path through it.
Some of the legal issues that have surrounded the second administration run the gamut, right there. Questions about presidential immunity, obstruction, election law. Thinking as a prosecutor here, what institution or norm scares you most in terms of potential breakdown, and how should journalists, particularly those in Washington right now, think about covering that most effectively?
I only get to pick one? Look, I mean, the Supreme Court, if it doesn't scare you, I envy you. The Supreme Court started scaring me when I was a young U.S. attorney, and John Roberts said that we were a post-racial America, and he gutted Section 5 of the Voting Rights Act, which was, for those of you who don't spend your lives with the intricacies of the Voting Rights Act, the reason Section 5 mattered so much is because it let us challenge bad new developments in intimidating or preventing Americans from voting. It let us challenge them before they went into effect so that we could keep the bad stuff from happening. After Shelby County versus Holder, we could no longer do that. But we were left with Section 2, which permitted us to challenge the bad stuff after it happened, after it had started. And although Section 2 had mostly been used for gerrymandering, to stop gerrymandering, it could also be used in other situations. And of course, that's under attack this year. There are people who expect that Section 2 of the Voting Rights Act, if it survives at all, will survive in a heavily neutered form. So, you know, there's voting, which seems to me important because it's the right that unlocks all of the other rights. And I worry about that. But of course, what we all worry about is this Supreme Court's tendency to weigh in favor of Donald Trump in cases which, on their face, just don't look like cases where he's entitled to win. This notion that presidents can't commit crimes is why you see pardons like the pardon that you saw today in the crypto market, right? And frankly, I had thought that the Supreme Court had left wiggle room when it decided the criminal immunity case, and that case would go back down and Jack Smith would put his evidence together and try the case, and there would be then an appeal saying, but wait a second, the former president is completely immune, and the Supreme Court would clarify, and they would say, well, you know, President Trump was immune, but candidate Trump was not immune. And so there are these two separate areas, one where a president can be held criminally liable and one where he can't be. And that is, quite frankly, not the world that we ended up in. And so the question that lingers in my mind is, will the Supreme Court be cognizant of that, and will we see cases this term where even though criminal is off the table, they will attempt to impose some limits on this president's efforts to accumulate all the power of government in his own hands? Or is this a Supreme Court that's all in on the unitary executive theory, the all-powerful presidency theory, that might, for instance, permit him to go so far as to use his little Sharpie pen to change the Constitution and write birthright citizenship out of the Constitution? I don't think the Supreme Court will go that far, simply because there's no legal basis for doing it. But, you know, we've all, people like me, been in the position of saying, oh, the Supreme Court will never say that the president could get SEAL Team 6 to assassinate one of his enemies and not be prosecuted for doing that. And so look, the court has a lot to answer for. They have a lot of power. They need to be covered ferociously. And by that, I mean it's important that we have some really first-rate journalists covering the Supreme Court, people who can explain legal issues and court hearings and what goes on in detail. And my sense is Americans are really hungry for that. And we have justices on the Supreme Court who write in such a clear fashion. You know, Sonia Sotomayor, you do not have to have been to law school to understand her decisions. Even when she's writing about complicated doctrinal issues, if it's an issue that matters to you, you can sit down with her opinions and understand them. I think, frankly, that's true of most of the justices, even the ones whose views I don't share. And that, I think, you know, journalists are the gateway drug. And the more people we can convince that keeping eyes on the Supreme Court matters to, the Supreme Court certainly knows when our eyes are on them. And I think, for instance, in the Section 2 Voting Rights Act case, to come full circle, we may see them temper their opinion in that case if they are worried that ruling against Section 2 so close to the midterm elections could cause a real grassroots swell of rebellion from us.
On the question of presidential immunity, let me take this opportunity to ask a question that came from the audience here. How likely do you think it is that the president is prosecuted when he leaves office, either for the Mar-a-Lago documents investigation or the January 6th case or something else?
So I think both of those cases will be past the statute of limitations by the time Trump leaves office again. There might be a period of a couple of months where there's something that could be done, but there's a 5-year statute for most federal crimes. There's some crimes where it can run a little bit longer, and the calculation can get complicated in a conspiracy case where the statute runs from the last clear act of the conspiracy. But y'all didn't come here for first-year criminal law, so I won't do that to you. I'll just say I don't think that we will see a resurgence of those cases. I know that there are people who would like to see them. I think it's deeply concerning that there has never been accountability at the top for January 6th. And I write a lot in the book about what that means, drawing that parallel to the end of the Civil War and the very limited prosecution that happened at the end of Confederate leaders, and how that really allowed this sort of myth surrounding the Old South to develop into the sort of, you know, tragic, romantic lost cause. And we've seen that so much following January 6th, with all of the January 6th defendants who are now pardoned, including those who were convicted for incitement for a very, very serious crime. And then we have the total absence of accountability at the top. But look, I think accountability for those crimes will not come in a courtroom. I think it will have to come at the ballot box, and that's where we're going to have to settle that score.
Let me come back to a point that you made earlier about the Pentagon press corps. So how have you been thinking about the situation where, you know, reporters, for those who don't know, reporters who are covering the Pentagon essentially were choose to force between signing an agreement that would relinquish their First Amendment rights or the ability to report from inside the Pentagon. And what do you think the American public really needs to know about this and why it matters, what we're seeing happening at the Pentagon, the sort of refreshed Pentagon press corps, as the secretary has referred to
the
them?
Russia Times press corps? I said it, you didn't say it. You know, you were making the point about how overwhelming this moment is. I think it's very hard for people to stay focused on any one story for any lengthy period of time. And if you think about what you were obsessed about 2 weeks ago, you know, maybe the National Guard piece is still there, but I find that the trajectory will shift very quickly. My hope is that that will not be the case with what has happened at the Pentagon and with these other infringements on the rights of the free press and other First Amendment rights. And it's a little bit self-serving, I get the point, for the press to be reporting on the press, right? In some ways, that becomes awkward. I hope that they will just push past that and embrace the reporting and make sure that when they're pushing, you know, with 24-hour cable TV or with new media outlets like Substack, that there's a continued push to cover the way this administration is trying to limit the access of journalists to reporting on government. The Pentagon is the best example that we have of that right now, but I know for a fact that it's happening at other executive branch agencies where government employees, perhaps some of y'all, are being told what they can and cannot do, and it exceeds the way those rules have worked in the past. And there are also big concerns among federal employees about monitoring of their communications. There's very clearly a systematic effort to tamp down on what can and can't be reported. And so again, I think this is something that we can all do, right? We get to choose the issues that matter to us, the issues that we call our members of Congress and complain about. This is a moment where the administration can either get away with what they've done at the Pentagon, or there can be a huge upswell of public complaint and pressure to restore the older way of doing things. I don't see that sort of pressure being mounted, to be quite honest with you. I think that this is at best a second-tier issue for people right now in terms of how coverage is happening. And we can simply do better on this one.
To your point about monitoring, I want to ask another question from the audience here, but I'll just preface it by saying, you know, we are seeing monitoring of federal employees at a level that, you know, we have not seen in any modern history. We're seeing surveillance tools used at protests by the Department of Homeland Security and other agencies. And in addition to that, we're seeing, you know, hacking of phone networks by foreign nation state actors and others. So that leads us into this audience question, which is, what do we need to do to protect our cell phone privacy?
You know, this is a tough question. We used to call this the going dark problem at the FBI and the Justice Department. And the idea was that the bad guys were outrunning us, and there was going to be this moment where they were so far ahead of us that we would just have no visibility, that we would go dark. I think the problem with trying to do good security on your personal privacy and on your electronic devices is that there seems to be a constant evolution. And so as soon as you do something, there's the next something. I don't know that this is a particularly sophisticated answer, but I will say there are services that keep up. This might be an area where you want to find an expert that you trust and rely on them. Because, you know, I'm not a Luddite, right? I'm never giving up my cell phone. It's just not going to happen. And so we accept some level of sort of concern. But I'll tell you, my husband, before I left home on this trip, was like, hey, turn your Life 360 back on, which is this program our whole family has on their phones, even with our adult children. It's sort of creepy. So that we always know where each other are. It's sort of reassuring, right? It's 2 in the morning. Where is your college senior? And I had turned mine off because I sort of thought maybe it's not a great idea to have that on all the time. We're like, you know, I'm sure that y'all have heard about the pizza deliveries that have gone to some members of the federal judiciary. And we are still getting anonymous pizza deliveries. We've become so sanguine about them, we just eat it for dinner. It's like, oh, look, pizza again. But I mean, I think it's rational for people to have those worries. Let's not jump the gun. Let's be smart and cautious, but let's not, you know, let them freak us out prematurely.
Let's pivot a little bit. So in August...
Is there an easy question?
Yeah, no, sorry, we do news here. In August, the president said he would probably not run for a third term, and in March told NBC that there are, quote, methods to assume office again. Do you think he's able to hold office for a third term?
Absolutely not. I mean, this is just bonkers kind of stuff. And this is such vintage Trump. Float the ridiculous idea, waffle about your interest in doing it, then put the 2028 hat on the desk in the Oval Office and put that on social media, and then make a video that's like 2028, 2032, I'm sure y'all have seen this video that he's retweeted on Truth Social, I guess reposted on Truth Social. And it is clear that Donald Trump is interested in staying in office forever. When we use the term king in this context, right? No kings. Donald Trump wants to be a king. It's just a nice word for dictator. And I think maybe we should take the gloves off and start calling it what it is, because this idea that an American president is going to violate the Constitution to stay in office, which, by the way, isn't that what he tried the last time? I mean, this is just second verse, same as the first. I think this is just a moment where we all have to stand up and say, this is crazy, this is wrong, this simply can't happen. I don't believe that even this Supreme Court would go along. But the problem with Donald Trump is he goes way far down the road before the courts step in. It's our job to make sure that just doesn't happen here.
Let's talk a little bit about the book itself. So you chose a striking title, Giving Up is Unforgivable. Was there a particular moment or an event that sort of crystallized that phrase for you?
Do y'all remember after the election, Kamala Harris has lost? Look, I'm a knitter. Kamala Harris is a knitter. I wanted a knitter in the Oval Office. I mean, I'm not going to lie. I thought she just had so much to offer the country, and I was so excited about that presidency, and I was surrounded by people, as crazy as it sounds, in Birmingham, Alabama, who felt the same way. So it was very disappointing. And I had a lot of friends, both in real life and online, who said something like this: I did everything I could have done. I didn't leave anything on the table. We worked like crazy. And democracy is just broken. Donald Trump broke it. I thought that was extraordinarily dangerous and very much could become a self-fulfilling prophecy that would give Donald Trump everything that he wanted. If we just cleared the path for him and said, have at it, brother, we would be so much worse off than we are now. If you think about all the roadblocks that we, the people, have managed to put up, they are significant and substantial. And we are very clearly problems that he has to deal with every day, and I am really proud of that. In that moment, I was afraid that we might not get there. And it was Joe Biden who said a couple of weeks after the election that giving up would be unforgivable, or words to that effect. And it seemed to me that it was that, right? It couldn't be like giving up is a bad idea, or maybe we shouldn't give up. I mean, it had to really be, we just can't walk away from democracy. The stakes are far too high.
And the subtitle of your book, right? A Manual for Keeping a Democracy. Why do you frame it that way? Why do you frame it as a manual? What does it say about, how you hope readers essentially use this?
So I had spent a lot of time reading Project 2025 and being impressed, as I so often am, by the Heritage Foundation's work product, because they have a lot of resources and very detail-oriented, organized people. And they put together really, whether you agree with them or not in terms of the process, very accomplished products. And they did that here. Project 2025 is a comprehensive vision for a country that does not look anything like the American democracy that I'm used to. I thought it was deeply frightening, utterly terrifying, and something that the Democratic Party failed to do. And look, I'm a lawyer, I'm not a politician, right? I mean, I don't advise candidates, I don't know what they're supposed to do. I wished somebody would have stood up a group that would have written a comprehensive response. Even if it wasn't, the detail that was in Project 2025, I wished somebody would have taken every chapter and written sort of like, no, actually, that's not what the world should look like. We shouldn't take federal employees and make it possible to fire them and get rid of all of the expertise and competence in government in one fell swoop and replace it with a sworn loyalty corps that will, in essence, be the president's shock trooper. Just little things like that were in Project 2025. And so this book is certainly not a comprehensive response to Project 2025. What I wanted to say was we have to prepare ourselves to run a marathon to restore democracy. And here's how we might start. So I do that with some rules, and I do that with some examples of things that have happened that I think are powerful. And mostly I hope folks will just understand that democracy is a spectator. It's not a spectator sport. It's something that we all have to find a way to participate in. It might look really different for different people. I've got a student who's an artist, and she, art as a path forward for democracy is great. There's nothing as important as having an anthem or a piece of art like President Obama did during the campaign. People can participate in the struggle for democracy in a lot of different ways, and they're all legitimate. And the notion is that if we all do what speaks to us, then we get there as a group in community.
In your view, I'll let you drink your water. I won't.
Thank you. You're such a nice person.
You're welcome. In your view, what are these sort of unforgivable moments of giving up that you're seeing most clearly in today's public life? And, what do we do about them?
Well, I think the good news is we are in a very different place than we were in November and December and January. And although there's still, and I'm sure that y'all know people like this, right? The folks who tell you, it's just too painful. I can't read the news. I can't pay attention. I'm overwhelmed. I just need to sit this one out and let other people do the heavy lifting. And I'm sort of put off by folks who take that attitude. I do get how it can be overwhelming. And for instance, if you're a young single mom and you're just trying to go to work and take care of your kids, maybe you don't have time to be as informed as somebody like me whose job it is to stay informed. So that's all for the good. But I think in this moment, we just have to find a way of staying informed, of prioritizing the knowledge, of prioritizing the future of democracy. And something that we do a really bad job of in this country is doing civics education. We do a great job in the fourth grade classrooms, right? I have law students all the time who tell me, fourth grade civics, my teacher talked about due process, and I was hooked. I've wanted to go to law school ever since that moment. And for so many people, they had that experience, but that was sort of it, right? And so I think something that we can do a job of as a community is making civics education really part of our daily lives, not something that we sort of brush off a little bit and say, it's a little bit cheesy to talk about this stuff. There's nothing wrong with loving democracy and being proud of America. And so when we think about the people who are giving up, I think about my youngest kid has just graduated from college. And those kids they have not had the same experience in many ways that we have had. They don't remember a functioning democracy. Donald Trump, for many of them, that's their first experience with democracy, the first Trump presidency. And so when I say to him, why aren't you out protesting? Your friends, you guys are smart. You get how much this matters. Why aren't you out? He's like, Mom, he told me at one point, and I wrote about it in the book, he said, when I was 4 years old, the Occupy protests happened, and nothing has changed. Wealthy people still control everything. So don't tell me I should go stand up against millionaires in Congress and try to right-size the equation. And my heart breaks the most for people in my youngest child's position. I think those are the people that we really have to do the most to work with, to explain the promise of democracy and to talk about what we can do if we stay the course. And look, part of it is dark, right? It's sort of like, okay, even if you don't think that there's upside in democracy, just think about how bad it is if there's not democracy. Because if Donald Trump is King Trump, then he doesn't ever have to taco, right? He doesn't ever have to chicken out again because he's worried about voters. He can just do whatever he wants to do. And that might mean that really important programs that right now Democratic senators and representatives are able to at least make some progress in, that they disappear as much as the Department of Education is about to.
How do you teach that sort of civics education to folks who are not in the fourth grade now, right? Is that explanatory journalism? Is it, to your earlier point about, trying to explain this moment, trying to explain what we're seeing from the administration? How do you get people to sort of pay attention and then understand the sort of very basics of how American democracy is supposed to work?
Do y'all know my friend Heather Cox Richardson? Who would have thought that a mild-mannered Maine historian could be one of the most popular figures in the country? You know, I read Heather every night because I'm a history geek, and I learned so much from reading her, both about old history, but also about the way that she assesses the history that we're living through, and writes about it so often in a non-judgmental way. But you know, she's never afraid to call it what it is. This is what we need to do more of. That's civics education in action. And if the demise of traditional media has had any positive results, it's, you know, the upgrowth on Substack of newsletters where if you have a niche that you're interested in, you can absolutely find someone who will help you explore it and understand it. And so for me as a lawyer, something that I really love, and you will love this, I'm a sentencing law geek. You know, I'm a former federal prosecutor. I spent a lot of my life working on criminal justice reform, and sentencing law is just this little niche area. One of my good friends left the Justice Department. He was the sentencing guru, Jonathan Wroblewski, and he now writes a Substack newsletter devoted to sentencing issues. And he doesn't write it every day, but I read it the minute it hits my inbox because it's just important to me. It speaks to due process and justice and how we treat marginalized people in this country who don't have voices, right? It speaks to the integrity of the Justice Department and how it gets restored. And I think for all of us, we now have this opportunity if we're willing to go out and find it, and we can find our little pods of people and engage on the issues that matter to us. That's civics education in action.
We talked a lot about this, the fatigue feeling, the sort of overwhelmedness of the news cycle, the unrelenting news cycle. How do you keep optimism and hope alive in your own life?
So, you know, I live in Alabama, and my husband's family was real involved in the civil rights movement. And most of the things that I know about sustaining yourself in a time like this come from years of conversation with people who were foot soldiers in Selma or in Birmingham, who would tell you that they didn't give up because they couldn't give up. I mean, giving up just simply was not an option for them either. And something that I think is very important that we can take from the civil rights movement is this notion that you should never worry alone about a problem like this. You should always be in community. You need to find people who will help you on the bad days and who you can help on your good days and their bad days. But the important thing for us to all understand is you do not have to personally defeat Trumpism, right? Some days there will be a fight that you can fight, and other days your job will be to support the people who are fighting, and always you will be in the room. You will be part of the community of people who are insisting on democracy in this country. And that fact that we really are all in this together, I think, is very sustaining and what will get us through this.
You're a former U.S. attorney, as we talked about pretty extensively. You've prosecuted really significant cases on public corruption and civil rights. How has that prosecutorial experience really shaped your view of the fragility and the resilience of democratic institutions?
You know, that's a really interesting question because I teach in the area of democratic institutions. I know it's become a dirty word, but I really am an institutionalist. I believe that the institutions are strong and that the institutions are nimble enough to protect democracy. The flaws that I see in the institution have far more to do with the people who are in the institutions currently than the institutions themselves, although I do think we need to take some of the reforms that we often characterize as soft norms, right? The post-Nixon reforms, for instance, the wall between the Justice Department and the White House that was supposed to prevent talking about criminal cases. I think those soft norms need to become a matter of law with consequences for their violation. I think the Hatch Act, which should prevent the president from doing a lot of what he's doing, requires more work to make it a matter of law. And so I view the institutions that way, and I view the Justice Department really is one of the most important institutions. And I often question myself, well, is it only because you work there and to you it seems important? And I think the answer is no. The Justice Department is chief among the institutions. You know, it is the only cabinet level agency whose name is a moral virtue. Justice. And it's what separates us in so many ways from the countries that the founding fathers were trying to leave behind. Countries where the justice was the king's justice, and we have the people's justice. And so I think keeping the institutions strong matters. That's your whole job, by the way, as a prosecutor. Your job is not to win cases. Your job is not to put people in prison. We are taught that we can strike hard blows, but they must be fair ones. And that the most important thing that we do at the Justice Department is preserving the American people's confidence in the way we are delivering justice to people so that we are always doing it fairly. I heard Jack Smith speaking, and I can't remember where it was. He's spoken more frequently in these last few days. I heard him talking about the fact that when he prosecuted cases, that he did it in the Bob Mueller model, and that what mattered to him was making sure he didn't speak out or do anything publicly that would prejudice a defendant's ability to get a fair trial. And that is so deeply ingrained in all of our souls. That's the way an institution should work. It's not the way many of our institutions are working in this moment. And so maybe we need to take some of the prosecutors' wisdom. I hear that, by the way, from my colleagues at the State Department and at the Department of War. People who deeply believe that institutional integrity matters, that process matters as much as substance. And maybe that's the key, is that it's process and institutions that have to be held up right now.
And I guess, how does that play out, right? We've seen in the last week or so, we saw in New Jersey, a judge harshly criticizing the administration for tweets that remained up in the case against Representative LaMonica McIver. We saw just an hour or two ago filing in the Letitia James case about signal messages between U.S. Attorney Lindsay Halligan and a reporter from Lawfare. How does that sort of play out now in practicality? We're seeing real life examples of a real question about whether someone can have a fair trial or access to non-prejudicial information.
It's really interesting. I tend sometimes to think about prosecutors, the Justice Department as one thing, and the courts as an entirely separate institution. But in reality, all of the lawyers and the courts work hand in hand. Judges can't just go out and issue rulings, right? They need lawyers to bring cases so that they have controversies in front of them that they can decide. And I think what we're seeing in this moment, perhaps the most hopeful development in this entire sorry affair, is the lawyers who are committing themselves to bringing the cases. Some very important lawyers in this country who have left big, cushy law firms and gone out on their own with young associates so that they are conflict-free and can bring cases or can represent defendants like Letitia James. That's the situation she's in, with a fabulous lawyer who's doing that. And we have judges across the country, particularly the district court judges and the courts of appeals judges, who are making rulings that are consistent with the moment and who are trying to tell us, if only we will pay attention. Sonia Sotomayor, again, I'll just return to her, has been writing in dissent and has been making these powerful statements about how democracy should work. And she's only able to do that because the lawyers are putting the cases in front of her and giving her that opportunity. But we really have to complete that picture then by paying attention in ways that many of us simply are not used to paying attention to the Supreme Court, and breathing life into that. And this is where I will make a pitch for what I think is the most important thing that we can all be doing. Because if you're sitting here, you're educated on these issues and you care about them, but you may be surrounded by friends and family who care less. Maybe they just have less time or less inclination and other interests. And what I have seen over and over is that it's our one-on-one conversations with the people around us. For so many people, you're the most trusted voice in their world. And when you talk with them about the importance of it and say, Can I just send you a paragraph explaining what this last Supreme Court case meant? You'll be surprised by how well people will respond to that. I spent 25 years in DOJ. Nobody ever stopped me in the grocery store to ask me how grand jury works. I can't tell you how many times that has happened, or how many times the woman who's ringing up my groceries will say, well, what did you think about that dissent in the United States? You know, which sort of just is a weird, it's like an out-of-body experience. And you're like, well, why did you read the dissent? And she's like, well, I read your newsletter and you told me to. I think that those are really important things that we can do. Thanksgiving is going to be a big day in America this year. I mean, Thanksgiving, I don't know about y'all, but our family dinner table conversation is going to be lit.
Let me ask this question from the audience here. It's a question from a professor at Indiana University. So earlier this month, the university fired their student media director when he refused to let IU administrators dictate the content of an Indiana Daily Student print edition. What can young journalists do to help protect freedom of the press?
You know, one of the most important things that I worked on as a U.S. attorney was integrating, this will shock you, right? Because this is the Obama administration. This is around I forget the year now, 2014 maybe? Integrating the sororities at the University of Alabama. Something that my number 2 guy in the office thought had happened when he was in law school, because he was the president of one of the powerful black fraternities. And as far as he knew, it had all happened back then, but you know, it didn't stick, as things sometimes don't stick. And what happened was a young African-American woman rushed an Alabama sorority, and the sisters wanted to let her in, and the parents who oversaw those decisions, the moms, told them no, that they couldn't have a young black woman in their sorority. And the way it came to my office was reporters at the Crimson, Alabama student newspaper, fearlessly wrote about that story. They came under a lot of pressure not to write about it. They wrote about it nonetheless. When I called them up and said, you know, y'all, what's going on? They were delighted to sit down and give me all of the details that we needed to convince the university that some sort of a consent decree settlement was in the university's best interests. And that progress has stuck in large measure. Student journalism is in so many ways vital. It's not only the proving field, right, for the professional journalist corps. They're so close to the ground. There's so much that they can do. So many of us went to colleges or universities or law schools or wherever that have student-led newspapers. This is a great moment when you're supporting journalism to support student journalism, whether that's financial support, whether that's showing up. But, you know, my good friend Barb McQuaid, who many of you know, my podcast co-host, Bob actually started life as a journalism student and worked on the student newspaper at the University of Michigan when she was in college. And that informs so much of the way she thinks. She's fearless about asking questions and being inquisitive. And I just don't know where we would be in this country without that.
I agree.
I bet you do.
So before I ask the final question here, let me just take a moment to thank our headliners team leader, Jen Judson, our entire headliners team, the club's executive director, Didier Soji, our membership and program manager, Cecily Scott Martin, and the entire club staff for making this event possible. And thank you to our audience for being here with us tonight. Joyce, let me present you with the National Press Club mug.
Cool, thank you. I love that. Look at that. That's gorgeous.
Now you have a
I'm a
token
big fan of
to
coffee.
take it home. Oh, good. Me too. And now I'll ask you a not hard question, as you say.
Good.
Who takes care of your chickens while you're on your book tour?
My college son, that little guy who didn't go out and protest, is really good with chickens. So I'll just tell you guys a really fast story. My husband's out of town mediating a case. We get a 5 a.m. text message. One of the chickens is egg bound, but don't worry. That means like there's an egg that doesn't want to come out on schedule. He's like, don't worry. I've given her a warm bath. Dad, she's going to be hanging out in your office on the desk today. I've made her. I mean, the level of care these chickens get is just legendary. They are very, very lucky chickens.
Very lucky chickens indeed. Joyce, thank you so much. And folks, if you will all, folks, take a selfie?
Yeah.
Okay.
You want to come do it?